All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating, most chaotic, and honestly most important periods in American history, the Gilded Age. This was a time of massive change, incredible wealth, and some really deep-seated problems that, in a lot of ways, made the country what it is today.
But before we go any further, we have to talk about that name, the Gilded Age. Notice it's not called the Golden Age. There's a huge difference. So what does it actually mean for something to be gilded? And boom, that right there is the perfect metaphor for this entire era. On the surface, you had all this incredible, shiny progress. Skyscrapers touching the clouds, amazing new inventions, and fortunes so big they're hard to even imagine. But if you scratched just below that glittering surface, you'd find poverty, corruption, and some really brutal working conditions. That tension, that contrast, is what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the incredible technology, the engine of progress. Then, we'll look at the powerful men behind it all, the titans and trusts. After that, we'll explore the millions of immigrants in A Nation of Newcomers. And finally, we'll listen to the people who started to push back in the voices of discontent.
First up, the technology. We're talking about the Second Industrial Revolution here, and it was an absolute explosion of innovation that completely transformed the United States.
I mean, just look at the pace of this stuff. The Bessemer process suddenly makes steel cheap and easy to produce. What does that get you? It gets you the Brooklyn Bridge, skyscrapers, and railroads stretching from coast to coast, connecting the country like never before. Then you get the telephone, and suddenly you can talk to someone miles away instantly. And the light bulb? It literally conquered the night, allowing factories to run 24/7 and changing how people lived. These weren't just small improvements, they were game changers. But, and this is a big but, this wave of progress wasn't hitting everyone equally. While the North was building factories and booming, the South was still recovering from the Civil War. It stayed mostly agricultural and ended up having to buy most of its manufactured goods from the very industries it was competing with up north. Now, all that industry didn't just create steel and railroads. It created staggering fortunes and a new class of super wealthy businessmen. So let's get into the empires they built and the millions of workers whose labor made it all possible.
So you have to ask yourself, how do we look at guys like Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, or John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate? Were they heroic captains of industry who built America, created jobs, and gave millions back to charity? Or were they ruthless robber barons who got rich by crushing their competitors and exploiting their workers? The thing is, they were kind of both. It really depends on who you ask. And they built these empires using some pretty brilliant and sometimes brutal business strategies. Carnegie was a master of vertical integration. Think of it this way. He owned the whole process, from the iron ore in the ground to the finished steel beam leaving the factory. Rockefeller, on the other hand, was all about horizontal integration. He just went out and bought up all his competitors, one by one, until his Standard Oil Company was basically the only game in town. Now, you can't have long hours, low pay, and dangerous work without people eventually saying enough is enough. Workers started to band together in unions. You had groups like the Knights of Labor, who were open to everyone and had big ideas for changing society. Then you had the AFL, which focused more practically on getting better wages and hours for its skilled members. But when they tried to flex their power in big strikes like at Homestead or Pullman, they were often met with violence. And time again, the government sent in troops to side with the owners, not the workers. Okay, so while all this drama is playing out in the factories, America's cities are just exploding with people. Millions of immigrants were pouring in from all over the world, completely changing the face of the nation and creating the crowded, energetic, and often chaotic cities we recognize today. And there was a really important shift around 1880. The old immigrants mostly came from places like Germany and Ireland. But the new immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Italy, Poland, and Russia, as well as from Asia. They often had different religions, spoke no English, and faced a lot more discrimination as they tried to build new lives. For most of those coming from Europe, the front door to America was Ellis Island. But getting through wasn't easy. Imagine after weeks on a crowded ship, you had to pass a series of stressful medical and legal checks. If you failed, you could be sent right back. And for Asian immigrants arriving at Angel Island out in California, the process was often much longer and way more hostile. So you finally make it in, but the reality of life in America could be a real shock.
A journalist named Jacob Riis used the brand new invention of flash photography to go into the slums and tenements of New York City. His book, How the Other Half Lives, showed wealthy Americans for the first time just how desperate and grim life was for the city's poor. And that reality was pretty tough. We're talking about life in tenements, dark, crowded apartments with no sanitation. You had corrupt political machines like the infamous Boss Tweed in New York, who would help immigrants in exchange for their votes, all while robbing the city blind. And all of this fueled a nasty rise in nativism, this fear of foreigners, which led to ugly laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the very first time the US banned an entire group of people just based on where they came from. But people didn't just quietly accept all of this. From the farms of the Midwest to the crowded city streets, all kinds of people started to raise their voices, demanding change and pushing back against the powers that be. One of the most powerful movements came from farmers. They felt like they were getting crushed by high railroad shipping costs and massive debt, so they formed their own political party, the Populist Party. And their ideas were considered really radical back then: government control of railroads, an income tax on the rich, and a change in money policy to help them out. The funny thing is, many of their radical ideas are just normal parts of our government today. And this anger was captured in one of the most famous speeches in American history. A politician named William Jennings Bryan declared that the government's strict gold-based money system was crucifying farmers and workers for the benefit of the big banks. That line, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," became a massive rallying cry. At the same time, back in the cities, you had reformers taking a different approach. People like Jane Addams started settlement houses, like Hull House in Chicago, to provide education and services to new immigrants. And crusading journalists, the muckrakers, kept exposing corruption and poverty, shining a light in dark places and paving the way for future reforms. But while all these new fights were just getting started, a much, much older struggle was coming to a tragic and violent end. For Native Americans on the Great Plains, the Gilded Age was the final, devastating chapter. Even after a huge victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the U.S. government came back with overwhelming force. The Dawes Act tried to destroy their culture by breaking up tribal lands. And then, in 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, marked the brutal end of armed Native resistance. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? The Gilded Age might feel like ancient history, but its central conflicts, they never really went away. Think about it. Today, we're still debating corporate power, the gap between the rich and poor, immigration, and workers' rights. All of those conversations are echoes from this wild, turbulent, and transformative era. It really forces us to ask, how is that same tension between the shiny surface and the complicated reality underneath still shaping our world right now?